At the beginning of the 20th century, there lived a man whose height seemed almost impossible by human standards. Robert Wadlow was born in 1918 in the United States, and during his childhood his growth began to completely deviate from the norm. By the age of 5 he was already over 5 feet tall, but what was truly surprising was that his body simply didn't stop growing. By adulthood, his height reached approximately 2.7 meters. Robert Wadlow wasn't considered a supernatural mystery. Doctors at the time discovered he had a rare condition, something we now know as gigantism, a condition that causes the body to produce a much higher than normal amount of growth hormone. But Robert Wadlow's story raises a curious question. If a single human being managed to reach almost 3 meters in height because of a rare biological condition, then how tall could the human body really be under different circumstances? And it is precisely at this point that some old photographs begin to attract the attention of independent researchers and those curious about history. In several records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, human figures appear that seem enormous alongside the people around them, individuals whose height seems even greater than that of Robert Wadlow, appearing in images taken long before any digital manipulation existed. Are these just extreme cases of very tall people? Or something more? Some believe that these figures may be clues to a human population different from the one we know today. A group that may have existed in the past and that, for some reason, disappeared from the official records of history. According to certain theories, Tartary would have been a gigantic civilization that dominated large regions of the world, a society that, according to these alternative accounts, possessed advanced technology and perhaps even a population physically different from ours. Are these old photographs showing only very tall people, or a history that may have been carefully erased? If you enjoy exploring strange photos from the past and unusual discoveries, consider subscribing to the channel, because here we take a closer look at forgotten details that might change the way we see the past. If these images were simply showing unusually tall individuals, the explanation might appear straightforward at first glance. Yet, the moment researchers begin to look more closely at the context in which these photographs were taken, the story becomes far more complex than it initially seems. Photography at the end of the 19th century was a slow and meticulous process, one that required heavy equipment, long exposure times, and carefully prepared plates, meaning that photographs were rarely taken casually and almost never altered after they were captured. The idea of digitally editing images, stretching bodies, or manipulating proportions simply did not exist in the technological landscape of that era, which is precisely why many people view these old photographs as unusually reliable historical records. In many of these images, the supposed giants do not appear isolated or hidden in the background, but rather stand openly beside groups of workers. Soldiers or townspeople, sometimes towering above them by what appears to be an extraordinary margin. Their proportions often look natural, their posture relaxed, and the surrounding individuals behave as if the presence of these unusually tall figures is not something extraordinary, but rather something familiar within that particular moment in time. For skeptics, these images may simply capture individuals suffering from rare medical conditions similar to the one that affected Robert Wadlow, cases of extreme gigantism that were occasionally documented throughout history. However, those who study these photographs more closely argue that the proportions sometimes appear far beyond what modern medicine considers biologically plausible, especially when the supposed giants seem to reach heights that would exceed 3 meters if the scale within the images is interpreted literally. Another detail that draws attention is the frequency with which these photographs appear in certain historical archives. In several collections of early photographs from regions across Eurasia and parts of North America, figures with unusually large stature appear again and again, sometimes standing beside large architectural structures or participating in labor scenes involving enormous building materials. For independent researchers exploring these archives, the repetition of these images raises a deeper question, one that goes beyond simple biological anomalies. If these photographs truly captured individuals of such extraordinary size, then who exactly were they, and why do so few historical records describe them in detail? And it is precisely at this point that the discussion inevitably returns to the mysterious name that appears, scattered across old maps and forgotten historical references. The name Tartary appears repeatedly in historical documents and maps produced between the 16th and 19th centuries, often used by European cartographers to describe vast regions stretching across Central Asia, Siberia, and parts of Eastern Europe. On many of these maps, the territory labeled as Tartary seems enormous, sometimes covering areas that today are divided into multiple modern countries. Yet the details about the civilization that supposedly inhabited this land remain strangely vague. To traditional historians, Tartary was never a single unified empire, but rather a broad geographical term used by Europeans who had limited knowledge of the cultures living across the immense Eurasian interior. The word itself often served as a catch-all label for territories inhabited by Turkic, Mongolic, and various nomadic populations, societies that were diverse, complex, and constantly evolving over centuries. According to these theories, Tartary was not merely a geographical label, but the remnant of a forgotten global civilization that possessed advanced architectural knowledge, large-scale infrastructure, and possibly technologies that modern historians struggle to explain. Proponents of this idea often point to the massive stone structures scattered across Eurasia, the sudden appearance of sophisticated city layouts in certain regions, and the strange gaps that sometimes appear within historical records of the 18th and 19th centuries. Some researchers claim that if Tartary truly existed as a powerful civilization that later disappeared from mainstream history, then the individuals appearing in certain old photographs may represent a population connected to that forgotten world. In this interpretation, the towering figures seen beside ordinary people might not be isolated medical anomalies, but rather members of a group that possessed different physical characteristics, perhaps shaped by genetics, environment, or conditions that are no longer present today. This idea is sometimes linked to the concept of guardians, individuals whose large stature might have given them practical advantages within ancient societies, whether in warfare, construction, or symbolic authority within their communities. In some speculative interpretations, these figures are imagined as protectors of large cities, overseers of monumental building projects, or representatives of a class that existed alongside ordinary human populations. Of course, at this point the narrative moves far beyond what traditional history accepts as documented fact, entering a territory where fragments of evidence, unusual photographs, and unanswered questions begin to blend with speculation. If Tartary was only a misunderstood name on old maps, why do so many unusual historical details seem to orbit around it, appearing in archives, photographs, and architectural mysteries that continue to puzzle researchers today? As more researchers began to examine forgotten archives, antique photography collections, and local historical records, a growing number of images started circulating among communities interested in alternative interpretations of history. Many of these photographs were not originally presented as mysteries at all, but rather as ordinary snapshots of daily life. Construction projects or military gatherings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In several photographs, individuals appear whose height seems dramatically larger than the people surrounding them, sometimes standing shoulder to shoulder with groups of workers who barely reach their chest. In other images, these towering figures appear beside massive building materials, stone blocks or wooden beams that already seem unusually large by modern construction standards. When these elements are viewed together, some observers begin to question whether the scale of these scenes might hint at something different from the conventional narrative, beyond photographs. There are also scattered historical accounts that describe unusually tall individuals appearing in various parts of the world. Travelers' journals, regional folklore, and even certain military records occasionally reference people whose height was described as extraordinary, sometimes using words such as giant, towering, or unnaturally tall. While many historians interpret these descriptions as exaggerations or symbolic language common in older texts, others wonder whether some of these accounts may have been rooted in real observations. Another element often mentioned by those exploring this topic involves the architecture found in certain older cities throughout parts of Europe, Russia, and Asia. There are buildings with unusually large doorways, massive staircases, and interior spaces that appear far larger than what would typically be required for average human proportions. Traditional historians usually explain these design choices through aesthetics, ventilation needs, or symbolic architectural styles common during certain periods. However, within alternative interpretations, these oversized structures sometimes become part of a broader theory suggesting that past societies may have accommodated people of very different physical stature. Of course, none of these elements by themselves provide definitive proof of a forgotten race of giants. Photographs can be misleading when scale is difficult to measure. Historical language can exaggerate reality, and architecture often reflects cultural expression rather than literal physical necessity. Yet, when these fragments are placed side by side, old photographs, unusual descriptions, and structures that seem larger than expected, some researchers begin to wonder whether these scattered clues might belong to a larger story. A story that, if it existed, might have slowly faded from official historical narratives over time. But if such a past truly existed, the question becomes unavoidable. How could an entire chapter of human history simply disappear? If such fragments of evidence truly existed, the next logical question becomes almost unavoidable. How could something so unusual simply fade from the official story of human history? One explanation offered by historians is surprisingly simple and perhaps less mysterious than many expect. History is not a perfect archive of everything that ever happened, but rather a constantly evolving interpretation built from surviving documents, archaeological discoveries, and the priorities of each era that studies the past. When records are incomplete, historians naturally favor the explanations that best fit the broader body of available evidence. In Zetzenze, the photographs showing extremely tall individuals might represent nothing more than rare cases of gigantism, similar to Robert Wadlow, combined with optical distortions caused by camera angles, perspective, or the difficulty of determining exact scale within old photographs. Without precise measurements taken at the time, interpreting the true height of someone captured in a century-old image can be far more uncertain than it appears. They argue that certain historical details may not have been deliberately erased, but gradually reinterpreted or absorbed into other narratives as scientific frameworks evolved. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeology and anthropology were still developing as modern disciplines. And many early discoveries were poorly documented, sometimes stored in private collections. Sometimes lost and sometimes reclassified as new theories about human evolution emerged. The famous burial mound excavations across the United States during the 1800s offer one example of how confusing historical records can become over time. Early newspaper reports frequently described unusually large skeletons being discovered in these mounds, although later academic studies suggested that many of those descriptions were exaggerated or misinterpreted. Over the decades, as professional archaeology replaced amateur excavation, many of the earlier accounts were dismissed as unreliable. On maps produced throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, vast regions of Eurasia were labelled under that single name. Yet, as geographical knowledge expanded and modern nations began defining their borders, the label slowly disappeared, replaced by more precise political and cultural identities. What once looked like a massive civilization on old maps gradually transformed into a historical footnote about how earlier cartographers described unfamiliar lands. So perhaps the mystery surrounding these photographs is not the evidence of a forgotten race of giants, but rather an illustration of how easily the past can be misunderstood when fragments of information survive without their full context. Old photographs have a strange power. They show us people who lived more than 100 years ago, standing in places that sometimes still exist today, wearing clothes that belonged to another era, looking directly into a camera that captured a moment none of them imagined would still be studied generations later. But photographs only show part of the story. They capture shapes, faces and surroundings, yet they rarely explain what was really happening in that moment. Who those people were, or why certain details seem so unusual when we look back at them today. And this is exactly what makes the images of these towering figures so difficult to ignore. In several of these photographs, the extremely tall individuals are not hidden in the distance or standing in awkward positions that could easily create an illusion. They are placed directly beside other people, often in the center of the image, sometimes resting their hands on tools, leaning against structures, or simply standing calmly among the crowd. More importantly, no one in those photographs appears shocked. The people around them are not staring upward in surprise. No one seems to be reacting as if they are standing next to something impossible. Instead, everyone behaves as if the presence of that unusually tall person is completely normal for that moment. And that detail raises a question that photographs alone cannot answer. If those figures were truly far taller than the average human of their time, why do the people standing beside them look so comfortable, so familiar with their presence? Were they simply rare individuals whose extraordinary height had already become known in their communities? Were the photographs capturing moments that we are now misinterpreting because we no longer understand the full context behind them? Or could it be that the past was more complex than the version of history that eventually became official? The truth is that a single photograph can start a question, but it cannot finish it. And maybe that is why these images continue to circulate more than a century later, quietly moving from archives to books, from books to the internet, and from the internet to curious viewers who stop for a moment and look a little closer